Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Tonight, we dive into a chilling tale where a fire lookout, isolated in the wilderness, discovers she's not alone. The engine of Kate Adler's truck hummed in the crisp morning air as she drove the last few miles along the narrow, winding dirt road leading to her destination. The Olympic National Park loomed ahead, its towering trees swallowing the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the dense forest floor. At 30 years old, Kate had never imagined herself here in the midst of such vast solitude. Her life had been a series of missteps, failed careers, dead-end relationships, and a constant struggle to feel grounded. This fire lookout job, tucked deep in the wilderness, was supposed to be her escape. A fresh start, far from the noise of the world and the failure she had come to dread. The fire lookout tower, an imposing structure of rusted metal, appeared like a mirage as Kate rounded the bend. It was taller than she had expected, its skeletal frame reaching up into the sky like a giant metal tree stretching into the canopy. A single cabin perched atop, its small windows glowing faintly in the early morning light. The beauty of it was undeniable, the silence surrounding it both tranquil and unsettling. As her truck rolled to a stop, she felt a strange, almost instinctive unease. The air felt heavier here, like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching her every move. Kate cut the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. She sat for a moment, staring at the tower before her, feeling its weight bear down on her. The wind rustled through the branches of ancient trees, sending a shiver down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but she felt small in the face of this wilderness, as if something unseen was lurking, waiting, observing. The thought crept into her mind before she could push it aside. The forest is watching me. She shook her head, forcing herself to push through the unease. It was just her mind playing tricks, surely. She had read the job description. Nothing about this place seemed dangerous. It was a job to keep the forest safe, watching for any signs of smoke, any indication of a fire. The isolation was part of the deal, the reason why it paid so well. She was alone, yes, but she had chosen this, hadn't she? She needed the solitude to heal, to start over, and nothing could be more fitting than this job. As Kate unloaded her gear from the back of the truck, she took in the view again. The forest spread out in all directions, rolling hills of green beneath the towering trees, the deep blue of the sky stretching endlessly above. She was perched at the top of the world, alone in the midst of nature's raw beauty. Yet the silence felt suffocating, oppressive even. There were no signs of life, no birds calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Only stillness, a stillness that seemed to weigh heavily on her chest. The phone in her pocket buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. With a sigh, she answered, expecting a call from her mother. "Kate, honey, where are you?" Irene's voice, filled with concern, crackled through the line. "I'm just pulling in now, Mom. It's fine, really." Kate forced a lightness to her tone, but she could already feel the weight of her mother's worry seeping through the line. "I've been reading about bear attacks in the area. Kate, are you sure this is a good idea? It's dangerous out there." Kate rolled her eyes, though a tight knot formed in her stomach. She couldn't blame her mom for worrying, but the constant concern was suffocating. "Mom, I literally just got here. Can I unpack first before you start planning my funeral?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Kate could hear her mother exhale sharply. "I'm just worried. I know how isolated it is out there. What if something happens? You're all alone, Kate. No cell service, nothing. Please, just be careful." "I will, Mom, I promise. I need this, okay? It's going to be good for me." Kate's voice softened, though it felt empty, as if she were trying to convince herself more than her mother. "I don't know about this. Please call me when you can. I love you." Irene's voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear she tried to hide. "I love you too. I'll be fine. I'll call once I'm settled. I promise." Kate hung up, her heart still heavy. She stared at the phone screen for a moment, then tossed it into her truck. The sky above her had started to cloud over, the day slipping into evening. The dark shadows of the trees stretched farther, consuming more of the landscape as the sun began to set. Kate set to work unloading the rest of her gear, but the quiet of the forest pressed in on her, making it hard to focus. She entered the tower, her boots echoing against the metal stairs as she climbed. The inside of the cabin was sparse. A narrow bed pressed against one wall, a small table and 2 chairs, a propane stove, nothing more. The radio equipment on the opposite wall seemed to dominate the space. Its cold, unyielding presence reminded her of the job she had to do: scan the horizon for smoke, log weather reports, and wait. Wait for something that might never happen. But as she set down her things, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a deep, gnawing sensation that she couldn't place. The wind had died down, but the stillness remained. Everything felt too still. Her eyes swept across the cabin. The windows, the door, the radio. The space felt too small, too confined. But it was the windows, the floor-to-ceiling glass on all 4 sides, that drew her attention. They offered a panoramic view of the forest, stretching far beyond where the eye could see. Rolling green hills, distant mountains, and not a single sign of civilization. It was like the forest had swallowed everything. She took a deep breath, willing herself to relax. She wasn't here to be afraid. She was here to work, to find peace. But peace was an illusion, and something in the air told her that whatever she had imagined about this place was wrong. As Kate started unpacking, the sound of something, a rustle, a whisper, seemed to reach her ears. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The wind had shifted. Had she heard something? No, she couldn't have. She moved to the window, pulling back the curtain. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was a figure. Not a person, but something else. Its silhouette blurred in the distance, a strange, unnatural shape. Kate's pulse quickened. She squinted, trying to make sense of it, but before she could focus, the figure vanished, swallowed by the trees. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she turned away from the window, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over her. It's just the wind, just a trick of the light. She couldn't let herself believe otherwise, not here, not now. The day was fading into dusk when the radio crackled to life. Kate grabbed the handset, her hands trembling slightly. "Tower 7, this is base. Radio check, over." Kate steadied her breath. "Base, this is Tower 7, Kate Adler reporting. I'm settled in, over." "Copy that, Tower 7. Welcome aboard. You'll do weather reports at 0800 and 1800 daily, plus immediate notification of any smoke or fire activity. Emergency frequency is channel 9. Any questions? Over." "No questions, base. Everything's good here, over." "Roger. Have a good first night, Tower 7, base out." The radio went quiet, leaving Kate alone with the endless hum of silence. She sat down at the table, staring out the window, trying to focus on the task at hand. She could hear the sounds of birds in the distance, but they felt far away, almost out of place. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, as if the forest were waiting for something. That night, the quiet was the loudest thing, and deep in the woods something watched. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the wilderness as the night slowly took hold. Kate Adler sat by the small propane stove, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The forest outside her lookout tower was quiet, eerily quiet. The world beyond her windows had transformed, the bright greens of the day now swallowed by the blackness of night. Only the occasional crack of a branch or the rustling of leaves broke the stillness, and Kate found herself jumping at every sound, though she couldn't say why. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? Solitude, peace. Yet as night fell, the isolation that had seemed so inviting during the day now weighed heavily on her chest, like a suffocating presence. The tower, far removed from civilization, had become her prison. She was here alone, completely alone, save for the strange whisperings of the forest that clawed at the edges of her sanity. The first night stretched out before her like an eternity. The wind howled in gusts, rattling the metal structure of the tower, and the trees swayed in unison, creaking as if they were stretching their limbs after a long day's work. Kate tried to settle into a routine, unpacking the rest of her supplies, but the oppressive quiet was unbearable. The usual hum of human life, the sounds of the city, the distant rumble of traffic, the distant chatter of voices was gone. It was just her and the wilderness now. As Kate lay down in the narrow bed, the sheets cold against her skin, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. The wind outside had died down, leaving a profound silence in its wake. But it wasn't the kind of silence that invited rest. It was the kind of silence that made her skin crawl, like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. She tried to ignore it, curling up under the thin blanket, but her mind kept racing. What was she really doing here? She had escaped the pressures of life, but was this where she belonged? Suddenly, she was jolted awake. The darkness was thick around her, and for a long moment she lay perfectly still, trying to listen to the world outside. There it was again, the faintest of sounds, a whisper. It was so soft that she wasn't sure if she had imagined it, but it was unmistakable. A low, muffled voice that seemed to rise from the depths of the night. Her heart raced as she strained to hear, but the words were too faint. "Kate!" The whisper came again, this time louder. Her name, carried on the wind, slithered into the quiet cabin like a serpent. Cold sweat dripped down her spine. She shot up in bed, eyes wide, her pulse hammering in her throat. The forest. Was it just the wind? She told herself it had to be. There was no one out there, no one but her. She glanced toward the window, but there was nothing, just the impenetrable darkness of the woods stretching endlessly in every direction. The trees swayed in the breeze, but no figure moved. There was no one standing at the base of the tower, no shadow lingering in the night. Still, the whisper had been clear. It had been her name. She couldn't deny it. Her breath came in quick bursts as she stood up, heart thudding in her chest. Kate went to the window, pulling back the curtain with trembling hands. The night was still. No movement, no sound, no sign of life. It was impossible to see anything beyond the faint outline of the trees, a black mass under the moonless sky. It was nothing, she told herself, pulling the curtain shut. It had to be nothing. Just the wind, the way the forest sometimes played tricks on your mind when you were alone. The wind howled again, but it wasn't the same. The sound of the forest seemed to be closing in around her, wrapping her in a thick, suffocating embrace. Kate lay back down, trying to calm her nerves, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind felt like a warning. The hours dragged on, her eyes darting from the shadows to the windows, convinced she could hear things moving in the dark. The silence had become oppressive, stifling, and her mind twisted into knots with the thoughts of what could be lurking just outside. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and her eyelids fluttered closed. Morning came too soon. The light filtered weakly through the fogged windows of the cabin, and Kate awoke with a start. Her body was stiff from the restless night, and her head ached as if the tension from the previous evening had settled deep into her bones. She got up and stretched, pulling on her jacket to ward off the morning chill. Her eyes scanned the cabin, seeking any sign that the previous night had just been a dream. But everything was as it had been before. The sparse furnishings, the stack of books, the radio equipment, all remained in their places, undisturbed. It was only when she moved toward the wall by the door that she noticed something unusual. A small scrap of paper, torn and frayed, was pinned to the wall by a rusted nail. The handwriting was crude, jagged, the ink smudged in places as if the writer had been in a hurry or in distress. The words on the paper were simple, but the impact was immediate. "You're not alone." Kate's stomach dropped. She froze, staring at the note, trying to make sense of it. Her hands trembled as she reached out to remove it from the wall. The message was so blunt, so final. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her mind playing tricks. The whispering voice last night, the one that had called her name, it had been real. Someone or something was out there. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned the note over. There was nothing else on it, no other words, no explanation. Just that chilling statement. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Could someone have left the note here? But there was no way. The door had been locked and no one had come in. With shaking hands, Kate stuffed the note into her pocket and made her way to the window. The world outside was still. The trees stood silent, the wind absent, as if the entire forest was holding its breath once more. She had come here to escape, to find peace. But what had she really stepped into? The whispers had already begun again. The day passed slowly, each moment stretching endlessly. Kate tried to focus on her duties, checking the weather equipment, logging the data, anything to keep her mind from racing. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the feeling of being watched never left her. It gnawed at the back of her mind, a constant, nagging presence that made her jump at every sound. The forest had its own rhythms, its own heartbeat. But what was it hiding? What was lurking just beyond her reach? That evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, Kate was certain of one thing: the forest was alive. Not with animals, not with nature's creatures, but with something far older, far darker. And it was watching her. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, its icy breath seeping into Kate's bones. The fire lookout tower, isolated at the edge of the world, had become a place of unshakable dread. The days passed in slow succession, and the nights, darker and longer, seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The forest outside had stopped being a serene landscape and had become something far more sinister, an entity unto itself that watched and waited. Kate had tried to tell herself that it was all in her head. The whispers, the strange figures that sometimes danced in the shadows, the sudden coldness that swept through the tower, none of it was real, she kept insisting. But as each day passed, the forest's grip on her tightened, pulling her further into a realm of uncertainty and fear. It was one afternoon, when the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor, that Kate found herself sifting through the previous workers' logs. She had been avoiding them, not wanting to delve into the dark past of this place, but now something pushed her forward. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the ever-increasing unease that gnawed at her. Whatever the reason, Kate flipped open the first logbook with a trembling hand. The pages were old and weathered, yellowed by time, the ink faded but still legible. She began to read the entries, each one an account of the ordinary duties of a fire lookout, weather reports, fire observations, and routine checks. But as she moved further into the logs, the tone shifted. The entries grew darker, more erratic. The once neat handwriting began to spiral into chaotic scribbles, the words hurried and fragmented. One entry in particular stood out. "I heard footsteps last night, but there was no one there. I think I'm being watched." Kate's eyes lingered on those words, a cold shiver running down her spine. She flipped the page, her fingers shaking. The next entry, written just days later, was even more disturbing. "They've been coming closer. I hear them every night walking around the base of the tower. They're not animals. I don't know what they are, but I can feel them, watching, waiting." The words burned themselves into Kate's mind. She felt an oppressive weight settle in her chest as she read the final entry from that worker, the last they had written before they disappeared. "I can't stay here anymore. There's something in the trees, something that speaks in the dark, something that mimics voices. I'm leaving." The last words were smudged, the ink blurred as if the writer had been crying or trembling when they had written them. Kate's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to dismiss the unease creeping into her mind, but it was impossible. The forest felt too alive. It wasn't just the wind she was hearing, it was something else, something far darker. The more she read, the more she began to understand that the forest had its own language, its own rules. And those who had come before her had learned that lesson the hard way. It wasn't just isolation that had driven them away. Something else had lurked in the shadows, something that preyed upon their minds, twisted their perceptions, and ultimately drove them to madness. Kate closed the logbook with a snap, her hands trembling. She sat for a long moment, staring at the cover. The weight of the history in this place pressed down on her. She had thought the tower was her sanctuary, a place to escape the chaos of the world. But now it felt more like a prison, locked in by the past, the forest, and something far worse. That night, the nightmares began. They started softly, like whispers at the edges of her mind, just beyond her grasp. The forest closed in around her, a dense, suffocating fog of trees and shadows. She could hear her own footsteps echoing in the distance, the sound distorted like it was being warped by the wind, but it wasn't her walking. She felt eyes on her, cold, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. Every step she took, the footsteps behind her grew louder, faster. The shadows stretched, reaching for her with clawed hands. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, rooted to the spot as the darkness enveloped her. Suddenly, the whispering voice broke through the silence, calling her name. "Kate." She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding in her chest. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the flickering glow of the propane stove. She could still feel the echoes of the nightmare pressing against her skin, the remnants of that voice still clinging to her ears. She sat up in bed, her breath shallow and uneven. The sound of the wind had returned, but it was different now, more menacing, like it carried a warning. The silence between the gusts seemed even more profound, the kind of silence that settled deep into the bones, making her wonder if the forest itself was waiting for something. Kate tried to shake off the remnants of the nightmare, but as she lay back down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing fear creeping in her mind. The whispers from the logs echoed in her thoughts. "They're not animals. I don't know what they are. What if they weren't just stories? What if the forest really was alive, and whatever was in it wasn't content with leaving her alone?" The footsteps came again that night. This time they were louder, slow, deliberate steps that climbed the metal rungs of the tower ladder. The sound was unmistakable, and Kate's heart raced as she lay motionless in bed, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window. She waited, barely breathing, straining to listen. The steps continued, one after the other, each one coming closer. She was sure she could hear the faintest shuffle, the sound of something dragging against the metal, as if it were moving with a purpose, climbing higher and higher. Kate bolted upright, her pulse hammering in her ears. She rushed to the window, her hands shaking as she gripped the curtain. She pulled it back, heart in her throat, expecting to see someone, a figure, a person, climbing up the ladder, but there was nothing. Just the empty darkness of the forest below, the tower's cold silhouette against the sky. For a moment she stood there, breathless, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had just heard. There had been footsteps. There had to be, but no one was there. It was then that she saw it. A figure, dark and distorted, standing at the base of the tower. It was humanoid, but its movements were wrong, unnatural. It jerked and swayed, its limbs bending at odd angles as if it were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Kate froze, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure stood still for a moment, as if it had sensed her presence, and then with a sudden, jerky movement it disappeared into the shadows. Kate's heart raced. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or the wind moving through the trees, casting shadows that looked like figures. But deep down she knew what she had seen. It wasn't an animal and it wasn't a person. It was something else. The fear that had been building in her chest now coiled tight, filling every inch of her. She wasn't alone in this tower, not by a long shot. The night passed in a restless blur. Kate tried to sleep, but every creak of the tower, every gust of wind made her body tense. She lay awake for hours, the whispers of the forest filling her ears, drowning out everything else. Whatever was out there, it was waiting for her, and the thought of it gnawed at her mind. Morning came, but the unease lingered. The forest was still. No sound of wildlife, no breeze. Just a heavy, suffocating silence that clung to everything. Kate stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling expanse of trees, trying to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The forest wasn't just alive, it was watching her. As she turned back toward the cabin, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There on the table was a note, a torn, crumpled piece of paper. She walked over, her hands trembling as she picked it up. In jagged handwriting, the words stared back at her. "They see you. They know you're here." Her breath caught in her throat. The note was from someone who had been here before. But who? And how had they known? The winds had shifted again, sweeping through the trees with a cold urgency that made Kate shiver despite the warmth of the cabin. The morning had been crisp, the light thin and fragile, and the forest still held the memory of the night's terror. But today was different. Today, something was off. Kate couldn't explain it. She had become accustomed to the eerie quiet of the forest, the oppressive weight of solitude pressing against her chest like a hand around her throat. Yet now something else lingered in the air, something she couldn't shake. As she moved around the cabin, tidying up and trying to distract herself, she noticed the distant hum of an engine. She froze. The noise grew louder, there was no mistaking it now. A vehicle was approaching, the faint rumble of its engine breaking through the otherwise still air. Kate's breath caught in her throat. No one was supposed to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and the isolation was one of the reasons she had taken the job in the first place. The radio had not been used to report any routine check-ins. Who could this be? By the time Kate had gathered enough courage to step out onto the small balcony, the vehicle was already parked by the base of the tower. A man in dark green Forestry Service gear stood outside, squinting up at her, his face obscured by the dim morning light. He wasn't a ranger she recognized, nor had he made any announcement over the radio. The man was tall, his movements deliberate but stiff, as if the very act of walking required concentration. He waved at her, a half-hearted attempt at a greeting, his face blank, like a mask that didn't quite fit. Kate hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to remain inside, but curiosity won out. She grabbed her jacket and descended the creaking metal ladder, the chill of the morning wind nipping at her skin. "Morning," she called out as she reached the ground. The man looked her over before responding, his eyes darting from side to side, never resting on her face for long. "Morning," he said, his voice slightly higher than normal, like he was forcing the words out. "I'm Lucas. I'm just here to check in, make sure everything's going all right up there." He gestured vaguely toward the tower. Kate eyed him, sensing the oddness in his presence, the tension that seemed to coil around him like a fog. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady though her pulse quickened. "I didn't know anyone was scheduled to check on me." Lucas shifted uncomfortably, looking over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. "Well, you know how it is. Just a quick check, make sure everything's in order." Kate studied him more closely now. There was something about his demeanor, something off. His eyes seemed perpetually on edge, flicking nervously toward the trees, his fingers twitching by his sides as though he wanted to grasp something but didn't know what. His smile was unsettling, a tight, forced curl of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I haven't seen anyone for weeks," Kate said, trying to make sense of his strange behavior. "Is everything okay out there?" Lucas paused, his gaze flickering toward the horizon, toward the endless expanse of forest that seemed to swallow everything in its path. "It's fine," he said quickly, his voice flat, almost too quick. "Just a routine check." He shifted from foot to foot, his nervous energy palpable. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. Kate felt a wave of discomfort roll over her but forced herself to stand her ground. Lucas seemed to sense her unease. He cleared his throat, then spoke again, but this time there was an edge to his words. "You should know this place. It does things to people, the land. It has its own hunger." His eyes locked onto hers, dark and intense. "The isolation, the silence. It gnaws at you, Kate. People who come here, they lose themselves. It's not just the loneliness. It's something in the forest. It pulls at you, makes you see things, hear things." Kate took a step back, the hair on the back of her neck prickling. "What do you mean? What exactly happens?" Lucas swallowed hard, his eyes shifting away from hers, scanning the trees once again. "I don't know, I can't explain it. People go crazy up here. The ones who have been here too long. They hear things, they talk about. Things that don't belong in the woods. It makes them paranoid. Makes them start believing things that aren't real." Kate's mind raced. Was this man just paranoid, or was he trying to warn her of something she hadn't yet experienced? She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore the haunting truth in his words. She had already felt the pull of the forest, that gnawing feeling that something was always just out of sight, always watching. The way the shadows moved differently, the way the air was thick with something unspoken. Lucas took a deep breath like he was trying to steady himself. "Don't trust what you hear out here, Kate. Not even me," he muttered, as though he had just said something he hadn't intended to. Kate felt a cold chill ripple through her body. She took a step back, her heart thumping in her chest. "What do you mean by that?" But before he could answer, Lucas gave a quick, almost frantic glance at the forest, then at her, his eyes wide with something between fear and determination. "You don't understand, but you will. Just don't trust anything, Kate. The land has a way of making you believe lies. You'll hear voices, you'll see things that aren't there, and when that happens, get out. Don't wait, get out." Without waiting for a response, Lucas turned and walked quickly toward his truck. His steps were hurried, his shoulders hunched like a man trying to outrun a predator. Kate watched him go, her mind reeling with confusion and dread. She wanted to call after him, ask him what he meant, but she felt an odd weight settle on her chest, as if the very air around her was heavy with unspoken truths. He climbed into the truck and slammed the door shut, not even looking back. The engine roared to life, and with a sudden screech of tires, he was gone, disappearing down the winding road, leaving the forest and its strange silence behind him. Kate stood there, her breath shallow, staring after the retreating figure of Lucas. His words lingered in her mind, each one heavier than the last. The forest had its own hunger, voices, things that weren't real. She had heard it before, whispers on the wind, things moving in the shadows. Was it just her imagination, or was something else, something far darker, trying to break through? The wind picked up again, rustling the trees, and Kate felt the familiar cold that came with it. But this time, it wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something more sinister. Later that night, when the wind howled outside, rattling the tower, Kate found herself sitting at the small table, staring into the dim light of the lantern. Her fingers gripped the edge of the logbook, the pages trembling beneath her touch. She opened it, her eyes scanning the entries of past workers. But something was different tonight. The silence in the cabin felt more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. Suddenly, she heard it. A soft, creaking sound like footsteps, slow, deliberate steps climbing the metal ladder. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was unmistakable, but when she rushed to the window, there was no one there. The forest was silent, dead silent. Kate's breath came in shallow gasps as she turned back to the door. And that's when she saw it, a scrap of paper, pinned to the wall with a single rusty nail. "Don't trust anything you hear out here." The note was in Lucas's handwriting, but Lucas was gone. Kate's mind reeled, the walls of the tower closing in around her. The forest was waiting. And now the truth she had tried to ignore was staring her in the face. It was never just the wind. It was never just the isolation. The forest had something in it, something that had been watching her from the moment she arrived. And it wasn't done with her yet. Irene sat across from Officer Autumn O'Brien, her fingers nervously drumming the table. The stark fluorescent lights of the room flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the walls of the small, windowless conference room. The air smelled sterile, like the absence of life itself. It had been 6 months since she had left the tower, 6 months since she had barely escaped the horrors of the wilderness. But the memories were fresh, and her body still bore the marks of what she had survived. Autumn shuffled through a folder, her hands deliberate and calm as she laid out photographs in front of Irene. The images were haunting, pictures of the aftermath of what had been left behind. The destroyed cabins, torn apart by claws far larger than any animal's. The remnants of the creatures, their twisted, contorted bodies frozen in death. But none of this was the truth Irene had expected to face. None of it was the relief she had hoped for. "Irene," Autumn said, her voice low and professional, "we've reviewed everything you've provided. The creatures, the attacks, they are part of a much bigger issue than we initially realized." Irene swallowed hard, the weight of the words settling into her chest. The truth had been unbearable for so long, but now, hearing it confirmed, it felt even worse. Her survival was no accident. It wasn't just the forest or some isolated madness that had driven her to the brink. Program, the one she had so eagerly joined, had been part of something much darker. The Forest Service knew, Irene whispered, barely believing her own words. You knew what was happening out there. Autumn didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her expression grim. Yes, we've suspected something for years, but the reports we've received never connected the dots. At least not in a way we could prove. The disappearances, the strange occurrences, they were written off as natural causes. Isolation, madness, wild animals, weather. But none of it was true, Irene. You were sent into a death trap and we didn't tell you. The silence between them thickened. Irene's breath hitched in her chest. She had suspected this, of course. The warnings, the strange behaviors of those before her. But hearing it out loud from someone who should have protected her was a different kind of betrayal. They used us as bait, Irene said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. The lookouts, we were just expendable. Autumn's face tightened, her jaw clenching. It wasn't supposed to be that way, but yes, the isolation was part of the experiment. The creatures, the Wendigos, have been tracked for years. We knew they hunted in these areas, but we didn't have a full understanding of how they operated or how to fight them. So the service used the fire lookout positions to gather data. Irene recoiled, a cold shiver running down her spine. You let people die to learn about these creatures, and you never told us. We couldn't. If the public had known, there would have been panic. We would have lost control of the situation. The forest would have been abandoned, and we would have been left with nothing. You were trained to believe the dangers of fire, but there was a far worse threat lurking in the trees. Irene's mind spun. She had spent months thinking it was just the isolation that had broken her, that the madness of being alone in the forest had gotten to her. She had thought it was her fault, but now she understood. It wasn't her fault. She had been part of a grand experiment, a cruel, twisted game where human lives were treated like disposable objects. They had all been sent there without full knowledge, forced to face the horrors of the forest without a chance of survival. They fed us to them, Irene muttered, the weight of her realization sinking in like a stone in her stomach. Autumn's eyes softened, though there was little warmth behind them. I'm sorry, Irene. I wish we could have done more, but now we need to do what we can to stop this from happening again. We're shutting down the fire lookout program entirely. No more solo assignments in remote locations. The creatures are real and we need to deal with them. Irene's mind raced, images of the twisted creatures climbing the tower, mimicking voices, tearing through the walls. She could still hear their haunting calls in her dreams. The memories, the fear, were never far from the surface. And the others? What about the ones who didn't make it? The people who disappeared? Autumn paused, her fingers trembling as she pushed another photograph toward Irene. This one was different, darker. It showed a body, or what remained of it. It was mangled, torn apart in a way that didn't make sense, like it had been ravaged by something otherworldly. Irene's breath caught in her throat. The face was unrecognizable, but she knew who it was, Walter. His eyes, wide and full of terror, were forever frozen in the photograph. They were not the only ones, Autumn said softly. There were others. Hundreds of disappearances, mostly unreported. The creatures have been active in this area for years, but we didn't know how to stop them. We've been collecting data, pushing people out there, thinking we could learn enough to defend against them, but we were wrong. Irene's hands shook as she reached for the photo, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. They were all bait. We were all just bait. Autumn nodded, her face drawn and tired. Yes, and now we need to fix it. We've shut down all the towers. There will be no more isolated posts. We've started implementing new safety protocols, including more frequent check-ins, and the rescue teams will be on standby for any emergency. We won't send anyone into those forests alone again. Irene's heart sank. The knowledge that she had been part of such a monstrous experiment twisted something deep inside her. She had come to the tower to escape her failures, to find peace. But instead, she had found a nightmare, a hidden war being fought with lives as collateral. How many more had been sacrificed for the sake of data? How many more would be? Autumn pushed a few more files across the table, the weight of them heavy, even in the sterile room. There's more. We're still investigating other areas. The creatures, Wendigos, are not confined to one location. They're moving, they're evolving. Irene felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She had thought that surviving the tower meant escaping the terror, but now she realized it wasn't over. It had only just begun. That night after the meeting, Irene lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. She could no longer trust the world she had come to know. The safety she had sought in isolation had been an illusion, a false promise. There were no safe places. There were no answers, only more questions. And as the days stretched on, the nightmares returned. The shadows crept closer, whispering her name in the dark. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. She had escaped the tower, but she knew now that the forest, those creatures, would never let her go. They would always be there, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of what had happened. But Irene was no longer the same woman who had arrived at the tower, naive and seeking solace. She was different now, hardened, scarred, and determined. The truth had been laid bare before her, and now it was time to fight back. She wouldn't let the creatures claim any more lives. She would be the one to stop them. Somehow. The tower creaked under the pressure of the wind, and the sound was beginning to feel like a warning. A voice whispering from the darkness that something wasn't right. Kate Adler stood at the edge of the cabin, her hand gripping the railing tightly, looking out over the dark forest. The trees swayed, their skeletal branches reaching toward the night sky, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Her breath misted in the cold air, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her stay here was no longer just about solitude. It was about survival. Days had passed since Lucas's visit, and the weight of his words had only grown heavier in her mind. The land had a hunger. The forest has a way of making people lose their minds. She had felt that gnawing pull, the eerie sense of being watched, but there was something even darker lurking beneath it all. She could feel it in the air, like a thick fog, heavy with unseen eyes. But the truth had not yet fully revealed itself. Not until that night. Kate had spent the day going through the cabin, organizing her supplies, trying to push the fear aside. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows crept in, she found herself drawn to a place she had avoided before, the old floorboards near the bed. The floor in the cabin was uneven, old and worn from years of use. The wood had shifted, leaving small gaps between the planks. It was a place where things had been hidden. An instinct had told her to stay away from it. But tonight something compelled her to look closer. Her fingers, cold from the evening air, brushed against the wood. She pressed down on one of the loose planks and it shifted, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached into the dark space beneath the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled out an old, weathered journal. The leather cover was cracked, the edges frayed as though it had been left there for years, decades even. The weight of the journal was oddly heavy in her hands, as if it contained more than just words. She sat down on the bed, her fingers trembling as she opened the pages. The ink was faded but still legible, the handwriting uneven and hurried. The first few pages were filled with mundane entries, daily observations about the weather, the condition of the tower, reports on the surrounding landscape. But as she flipped further, the tone of the writing changed. The entries became fragmented, more erratic, as though the writer had been slowly losing his grip on reality. April 4th, 1956. They're watching me. I hear them at night moving around the base of the tower. At first I thought it was just animals, bears maybe, but no, this is different. These aren't animals. They don't move like animals. I've seen them. Shadows, humanoid figures. Their faces are hidden behind masks, but I know they are there. They're not from this world. Kate felt a chill run through her as she read the words, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She turned the page, her fingers now slick with sweat. April 10th, 1956. I don't know what's happening anymore. Last night I heard my name being called from the forest, but when I went to the window there was no one there. I thought I was losing my mind. I checked the radio and there was nothing, no one to help. The voices. They're not real, but they sound so real. They sound like people I know. It's them, the things in the trees. They mimic voices. They're trying to get me. Kate stopped reading for a moment, her pulse quickening. She glanced around the cabin, the silence pressing in on her. The forest outside was still, but she could almost feel the presence of something lurking just beyond her sight. She turned back to the journal, her hands trembling as she flipped to the final entries. April 20th, 1956. They came for me tonight. I saw them fully. Tall, humanoid figures with twisted faces, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They were calling me, mimicking my friends' voices, luring me out into the woods. I tried to resist, but the call was too strong. I had to go. They wanted me to follow them. I didn't, but they know how to get you to follow. They know your weaknesses. They know your fear. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The forest, it has a way of making you see things, making you hear things. It's not just the isolation, it's something else, something worse. I'm not sure I'll make it out alive. I don't know what's happening to me. Kate's hand shook as she closed the journal, her mind racing with the implications. The creatures described in the journal were exactly like the ones she had seen, tall, humanoid, their faces obscured by something dark and unsettling. The voices they mimicked, the way they lured their prey into the forest. It was all there. Every detail matched what she had experienced. Her stomach churned as she realized the truth. The forest was alive, and it wasn't just the land that was dangerous. It was what lived in it, what waited for the unsuspecting. These creatures weren't just spirits. They were something far worse, something ancient, something parasitic. Kate dropped the journal, her breath coming in short gasps. She felt the weight of the revelation settle heavily in her chest. The creatures weren't just haunting the forest. They were feeding on fear, manipulating their prey psychologically before they attacked. They thrived on the isolation, the loneliness, the desperation. And now they were after her. As she sat in the darkness of the cabin, the wind howling outside, Kate could feel the pull of the forest again. The whispers, the strange movements in the trees, they weren't just the wind or her imagination. They were real. The creatures were watching her, waiting for her to break, to make a mistake, to let her guard down. They wanted her to fear them. And she did. She feared them more than anything else she had ever encountered. It was then that she heard it, soft at first, almost imperceptible over the wind. But it was there, a whisper, her name. Kate. Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from just beyond the door. Kate's pulse raced, and before she could stop herself, she was up and at the window, peering out into the blackness. She saw nothing, just the empty forest, the shadows of trees stretching into the night. But the voice came again, louder this time, clearer. Kate, come to the edge, come to us. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the forest. The creatures had come, they were here, and they wanted her. She turned away from the window, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. The fear that had been bubbling under the surface erupted into something primal, something that made her want to run, to leave. But she knew she couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. The forest surrounded her on all sides, and the creatures were closing in. For the first time, Kate truly understood the terror of the place she had chosen. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was a predator, and she was its prey. The voice came again, calling her name, pulling her toward the edge of the tower, toward whatever waited in the darkness beyond. Kate didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen, caught in the grip of a fear she couldn't shake. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the voice stopped. Kate didn't dare move for several long minutes. She stayed by the window, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes darting toward the door. The silence was deafening. The creatures had retreated, at least for now, but she knew they were out there, watching, waiting. With trembling hands, Kate reached for the radio, the cold metal of the handset grounding her. She keyed in the frequency, her voice shaky as she spoke into the mic. "Base, this is Tower 7. I need assistance. Now, I'm not alone." The radio crackled to life, but the response she received was not what she expected. There was no voice on the other end, no reassurance, no help, just static and the faintest whisper carried on the wind. "Not even the radio can help you now." Kate's heart pounded. The creatures were already here, and they had already begun to feed. The wind was louder now, howling against the tower like a wild animal in search of its prey. Kate Adler sat in the corner of the cabin, her back pressed against the wall, her hands trembling as they wrapped around the flare gun she had taken from the emergency supplies. Her eyes scanned the darkness beyond the window, searching the ever-growing shadows for any sign of movement. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The creatures had already cornered her, their presence now a constant, suffocating weight in the air. She knew that there would be no rescue. The radio had gone silent. There was no one out there, no one who would help her. Her mind raced back to the note, the words that haunted her still. "The forest has a way of making you lose your mind." It was true. She had seen it in Lucas, and now she was beginning to feel it herself. The forest, the creatures, they were breaking her down piece by piece. But Kate refused to let it consume her. She had survived the first night, and she would survive this too. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't give in to the fear that gripped her heart, no matter how much it clawed at her from the inside. She moved quickly, methodically, her hands moving over the supplies she had gathered. She stacked cans of food, water bottles, and anything that could be used to defend herself. The battery-operated lanterns flickered ominously in the dark corners of the cabin. Every sound, no matter how small, set her on edge. The metal of the tower groaned under the strain of the wind, the whole structure shaking in the night like it might collapse at any moment. She pushed the chair under the door to block it, then placed whatever heavy objects she could find against the windows, hoping it would buy her enough time to think. But there was little time. She knew that. The creatures would not wait for her to be ready. They were already out there, lurking in the trees, watching from the shadows. Kate took a deep breath, steadying herself. The tower was her fortress now, and it would be her battleground. The creatures wanted her, needed her more than she wanted to admit. She had to make them understand that she wasn't going down without a fight. The first sound came just after midnight. It was soft at first, an eerie scratching sound like claws dragging against metal. Kate's blood ran cold as she recognized it instantly. The creatures had arrived. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself against the wall, clutching the flare gun tightly. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if they were testing the tower's defenses. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the night air, the sound unnatural, inhuman. The metal beneath her feet creaked and groaned as something climbed, something heavy, something relentless. Then came the pounding, a deafening slam against the tower legs. The whole structure trembled under the weight of it, the sound vibrating through Kate's bones. She staggered backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She rushed to the window and peered through the blinds. In the dim light, she could make out the shapes below, dark figures moving with unnatural speed and precision, their limbs bending in impossible angles, clawed hands reaching up toward her. Kate's eyes widened as the first creature reached the base of the tower, its elongated fingers scraping against the metal ladder. It was a nightmare made flesh, tall, humanoid, its face obscured by a mask-like distortion. But Kate knew it wasn't a mask. It was a face, twisted, warped, a grotesque mimicry of humanity. And those eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, were fixated on her. A voice, soft and broken, echoed up from below. "Kate, come down, we just want to talk." Kate's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was Lucas's voice, mimicked perfectly by the creature. She stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. It was him, or rather, it was something pretending to be him. But she couldn't trust it. She couldn't trust anything anymore. Her mind spun as the creature continued to climb, its movements jerky, its limbs moving in unnatural ways as if the body wasn't fully in control. The scratching sound intensified as the creature reached the top of the ladder, claws scraping against the metal. With a surge of adrenaline, Kate grabbed the flare gun, her hands shaking but resolute. She fired it toward the base of the tower, the brilliant red flare lighting up the night sky, illuminating the creatures below. The flare's light revealed more of them, 3, 4, no more. They moved in eerie synchrony as if they were part of some twisted hive. For a moment, the creatures froze, the light momentarily blinding them. But then, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment, they surged forward. The leader, the one with Lucas's face, reached the top of the ladder, its distorted features twisting into a grotesque grin. "Kate," it said again, its voice laced with malice, "we've been waiting for you." Kate's stomach churned. She raised the flare gun, aiming directly at the creature, but before she could fire, it lunged at her, moving too fast, too violently. She stumbled back, crashing into the table. The creature's hand shot out, its claws grazing her arm as it climbed toward her, its breath hot and foul against her skin. With a scream, Kate shoved the creature away, scrambling for anything she could use as a weapon. She grabbed a knife from the table and swung it wildly, slashing at the air. The creature hissed, its lips curling back to reveal rows of sharp teeth, its form shifting as it writhed in agony from the blow. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. Kate's mind raced, her pulse surging with panic as the creature reached for her again. She had to get out. She had to escape, but there was no escape. She was trapped. Another creature appeared at the window, its face pressed against the glass, its eyes wide and hungry. It wasn't Lucas, it was something far worse. The creature's face twisted, its expression changing from mock concern to something darker, something colder. "You think you can survive this?" It hissed, its voice a low, mocking growl. "You're already ours, Kate." Her eyes darted to the door. There was no time, there was no way out. But she wasn't going to go down without a fight. With a cry of desperation, Kate hurled herself at the window, smashing through the glass. The cold wind whipped around her as she fell, but the creatures didn't follow. Instead, they were watching, waiting. They were waiting for her to break. As Kate scrambled to her feet, the forest around her seemed to close in, the trees twisting, the shadows lengthening as if the land itself was reaching out for her. She could hear them, the creatures, watching from the darkness, their eyes glinting like lanterns in the night. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. The creatures had shown her their true nature. They were parasites, feeding on fear, using their mimicry to tear down their prey. The forest was alive and it was hungry. Kate had thought she could survive, that she could outlast whatever nightmare had come for her. But now, as she stood alone in the forest, surrounded by creatures who could wear anyone's face, she knew one thing with terrifying certainty. They weren't going to let her escape. Not until they had torn her apart, body and soul. The hunt had begun, and Kate was their prey. The darkness had never felt so complete, so utterly suffocating. Outside the tower, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the stillness almost as unnatural as the creatures that had hunted her for days. Inside, the walls of her small cabin were closing in around her, the metal and wood creaking under the strain of the forces trying to tear them apart. The weight of the creature's relentless assault was too much for the fragile tower, and Kate could feel it. A subtle tremor beneath her feet, the ominous groan of the structure as if it were a living thing in agony. The tower was coming apart. Kate stood at the window, gripping the railing with white knuckles, her heart hammering in her chest. Her body ached, every muscle screaming from the adrenaline, the exhaustion, the terror. She had no illusions left. There was no way out. The creatures had her cornered, their presence a constant, sickening pressure pressing against her mind. There was no rescue, no help, no hope. It was just her now, alone in the wilderness with monsters that would stop at nothing to consume her. The creatures' attacks had grown more ferocious, more desperate. They no longer waited in the shadows. They charged at her, their distorted forms crashing into the tower's supports, clawing at the structure with a fury that shook the ground beneath her. They were relentless, pounding the base with their inhuman strength, causing the tower to sway violently as if it might collapse at any moment. Their twisted faces appeared in the gaps between the metal, their eyes glowing with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Kate had tried to run. She had tried to find a way out. But every escape route had been blocked, every window shattered by their claws. The creatures were everywhere, circling the base of the tower, their faces flickering in and out of the shadows, always watching, always waiting for the moment when she would break. The finality of the situation settled over her like a stone in her gut. This was it. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The creatures would come for her, but she would not go down without a fight. She would not let them win. The flare gun was still in her hand, the cold metal smooth beneath her trembling fingers. She could feel the heat from the earlier flare still lingering in the air, its light a distant memory. But now, in the encroaching dark, the creatures were more dangerous than ever. The only thing that had kept them at bay was the light, the one thing that they feared. And Kate knew now with sickening certainty that her survival depended on it. With shaking hands, she fumbled through her emergency supplies. She found the extra flares, the spare flashlight. She set the flare gun down on the table, not trusting herself to hold both it and the flashlight at once. She needed both. The flashlight was her last line of defense. As she checked the batteries, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. The creatures were back. They had found her again. Kate turned toward the door, her heart racing. The creatures' whispers reached her ears, distorted and garbled, as if they were speaking through the very walls of the tower. Their voices were low, barely audible, but their intent was clear. They were getting closer. The first figure appeared in the window, tall, thin, its limbs twitching unnaturally as it moved. The mask-like face was featureless, just a blank canvas, but its eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unholy hunger. They stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, and Kate felt the primal terror surge within her once again. But this time it was different. Kate didn't hesitate. She grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, bathing the creature in a harsh beam of light. It recoiled, its limbs jerking backward as if the light were burning it. The creature hissed in pain, its body writhing as it tried to retreat from the light. Kate pushed forward, taking a step closer to the window, her heart pounding. She could see the others, more of them, creeping closer to the tower, their twisted faces emerging from the darkness like grotesque masks. They were afraid of the light. The realization hit her with the force of a bolt of lightning. The creatures feared it. With a surge of newfound resolve, Kate grabbed the flare gun. Her hands were steady now as she aimed it toward the creatures below. They hesitated, the light from the flare gun blinding them as it shot into the night, creating a brief but intense illumination. The creatures screamed, their shrill cries filling the air as they scrambled back into the shadows. Kate's breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. She fired another flare, the red light erupting into the darkness, pushing the creatures back, keeping them at bay. The flare burned brightly, scorching the night with its harsh glow, but it wasn't enough. Kate could see them moving, shifting, circling, waiting for the flare to burn out. They were patient. They were relentless. And then the tower shook again, this time with a deafening crash that made Kate's heart stop. The creatures had found a weakness. The structure groaned under the pressure of their assault, and for a moment Kate thought the tower would collapse entirely. The metal supports groaned and snapped under the creature's force. She stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. The ground beneath her feet buckled and the walls of the cabin splintered as the creatures tried to force their way in. The once sturdy tower was buckling under their assault. Kate knew she didn't have much time. She was running out of options. She needed to end this now. She grabbed the emergency radio, pressing the button desperately. "Base, this is Tower 7. I need help now." Her voice cracked, her fear rising like a tide. But the static on the other end was deafening. No response. She slammed the radio down in frustration, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As the creatures closed in, Kate fired the flare gun one more time. The creatures recoiled, but they were too many. One by one, they circled the base of the tower, clawing at the metal supports, dragging themselves up the sides like predatory insects. Their distorted faces filled the windows, grinning at her with their sickening, gaping mouths. They had her cornered. There was nowhere left to run. With a roar of desperation, Kate threw the flare gun aside and reached for the last remaining weapon, the knife she had been keeping close. She knew it wouldn't be enough to defeat them, but it was all she had left. She stepped toward the window, facing the creatures head-on, and then, just as she raised the knife, the ground beneath her feet shifted again and the entire tower began to collapse. Kate gasped, stumbling as the walls cracked and splintered around her. The tower was falling. The creatures had won. But she wasn't going down without a fight. As the metal twisted and snapped, the creatures retreated into the shadows, their shrieks echoing in the night. The light from the flare guns and the flashlight flickered, then died, leaving only the darkness behind. Kate lay on the floor, battered and bruised, her body aching from the fall. She was surrounded by the ruins of the tower, the remnants of her last stand scattered around her. The creatures had retreated for now, but she knew they would return. They were never far away. The forest had won, but Kate wasn't finished. She watched as the last bit of light faded from the horizon, the creatures retreating into the shadows once again. The forest had claimed her, but she would survive. She had to. Kate Adler was not just a victim of the forest. She was a survivor, and she would not let the creatures have her. Not yet. Not ever. The first thing Kate felt when the helicopter touched down on the forest floor was a profound, disorienting silence. It wasn't the absence of sound. She had grown accustomed to that. It was the stillness of being free, the kind of silence that came when you were no longer trapped. She had not realized how much the forest had consumed her until she heard the faint whir of the helicopter blades, the first sound that had truly been her own in weeks. And even then it felt hollow. As the heavy door of the helicopter swung open, Kate was barely able to lift her head. The moment she stepped out of the wilderness, it all felt wrong, unnatural. The forest, the creatures, the shadows, had they all followed her? Had they come with her? She wasn't sure. She couldn't remember when she had last felt entirely human. The haunting screams of the creatures, still echoing faintly in her mind, were so fresh that they seemed to pulse through her every nerve. The rescue team, all wearing tactical gear, moved quickly, their faces masked in professionalism, but Kate could see the concern in their eyes as they approached her. The leader, a tall man with dark eyes and a weathered face, knelt before her. He said something, but the words didn't reach her. She was still trapped in the memories of the tower, her body covered in dirt and blood, her limbs stiff from the terror and the long, endless hours of fighting for survival. The helicopter had been a blur, its descent coming like a dream she didn't want to wake from. She had left the forest, but in many ways it had never truly left her. "Kate," the man asked again, his voice softer now. "Can you hear me?" She nodded, but the motion felt mechanical, like it wasn't quite her doing it. The world felt distant, as if she were observing from a far-off place. There were voices around her, shouts, questions, orders, but they felt disconnected, unreal. Her body moved on its own, as if detached from her mind, which was still reeling from what she had experienced. They helped her to the helicopter, their hands steadying her as she stumbled, legs weak and uncoordinated. But none of it felt real. How could she explain what had happened? How could she put into words the horrors of the forest, the creatures, the twisting of reality itself? As the helicopter ascended, she looked out over the wilderness she had left behind, her mind full of images too vivid, too grotesque to be real. Days passed in a haze. Kate was given medical attention, tended to for cuts, bruises, and the physical toll of her harrowing experience. She was fed, clothed, and bathed, but nothing eased the crushing weight of the memories that refused to leave her. The doctors and nurses spoke to her, asking questions she could hardly answer. They said it was PTSD. They said it was the isolation. But what they didn't understand was that it wasn't just the isolation that had broken her. It was the things she had seen, the things she had heard. They were still out there. She could feel them. Kate had been rescued, but she wasn't the same woman who had walked into that tower weeks ago. She had become a shell of herself, haunted by nightmares that didn't end when she woke. In the dead of night she would hear them again, The voices of the creatures, distorted and mocking, calling to her from the darkness. The forest's silence had taken its toll. The quiet now seemed like a lie, an illusion. Even when the world around her was bustling with life, the sounds of the creatures' whispers filled the empty spaces, making every moment feel like it might be the beginning of the end. It wasn't just the voices. It was the feeling that she was still being watched, that something was still out there waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to break. She could sense their eyes on her, even in the safety of the city, even when she was surrounded by people who couldn't possibly understand. The creatures had left the forest, but their reach was long. They had followed her back, and they were waiting. The nightmares came first. At first they were soft, like the whispers she had heard in the tower, barely audible, like a voice just beyond her grasp. But as the days stretched on, the nightmares grew more vivid, more real. She could feel the creature's presence pressing in on her, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. Sometimes she would wake up, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as though the creatures were in the room with her. She would listen for their footsteps, for the sound of their clawed hands dragging against the walls, but there was nothing, nothing except the silence, the same silence that had tormented her in the tower. But the silence was a lie. The creatures were still there, she could feel them. The questions never stopped. The authorities, the rescue teams, even the therapists, they all asked the same thing: what happened out there? But how could she explain? How could she articulate the horrors she had faced in the tower, the terror of seeing those creatures twist in the darkness, their distorted faces leering at her from beyond the trees? How could she explain the way they mimicked the voices of those she had known, of Lucas, of the others who had come before her? They had all fallen prey to the same nightmare, and now she was the one left to tell the tale. But the truth was too monstrous, too incomprehensible. What could she say? That the creatures had been playing with her, toying with her mind, using her fear as a weapon. That the forest itself had a hunger, a darkness that fed on human terror. No one would believe her. They couldn't. They said it was trauma. They said it was the isolation. But Kate knew better. She had seen what was out there. And no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many medications they gave her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching. The creatures had found her, and they would never let her go. The fear was suffocating. It wasn't just the nightmares or the voices. It was the feeling that they were waiting for her to slip. That the forest was still out there, its eyes watching her every move, its hunger never sated. Even now she could feel them, could hear their whispers, feel the heat of their presence. But it was the truth that would come crashing down, as it always did. Kate found herself walking the streets, surrounded by people, yet still feeling so completely alone. She didn't belong here anymore. She couldn't. The world she had known before the tower, before the creatures, felt distant, foreign, like it had never truly existed. She couldn't talk to anyone about what she had seen. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't. And so she withdrew. She isolated herself again, only this time it wasn't the tower that kept her isolated. It was the creatures. They had followed her. The memories of their eyes glowing in the dark never left her. The whispers never ceased. Kate had survived, yes, but she was forever changed. There was no going back. The unanswered questions lingered in her mind. Why had the forest chosen her? Why had she been spared? What had the creatures wanted from her? She didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never escape their grasp. They were still out there, waiting, watching. And as long as they were, Kate would never be free. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see their eyes, their faces twisted in the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the silence. Only the whisper of the forest. and the gnawing, ever-present fear that she would never escape it. The creatures were still there, and they would be waiting for her when she finally lost the will to fight. The city was alive, too alive. Kate Adler stood at the entrance of her apartment building, her eyes scanning the street, where the sounds of traffic filled the air like an unrelenting pulse. The honking of horns, the chatter of people, the distant sirens, all of it buzzed in her ears, overwhelming her in a way she hadn't expected. She had come back to the city after months of being lost in the wilderness, but it felt more like a foreign land now, an alien world filled with noise and movement she couldn't escape. Her mind kept slipping back to the forest, to the creatures, to the quiet that had once been her prison. There was no escaping the feeling that the city's noise was just another version of the oppressive silence she had known in the tower. In the forest, the quiet had been suffocating, broken only by the whispers of things that shouldn't exist. Here in the city, the noise was suffocating in its own way, constant, never-ending, inescapable. The background hum of the world felt wrong, a harsh contrast to the silence that had haunted her every waking moment in the tower. As she made her way to her apartment, the familiar door standing in front of her seemed almost like a barrier to the life she had left behind. She turned the key, the sound of the lock clicking in her ears like a death knell. The apartment was exactly as she had left it, neat, tidy, normal. The air smelled faintly of dust, the way it always did when something had been untouched for a while. Yet it felt foreign to her now, as if it wasn't her space anymore. How could it be? After what she had endured, how could this apartment, this world of constant noise, ever feel like home again? She walked into the living room and dropped her bag on the couch. Her eyes flicked over the small room. Nothing had changed. The bookshelf was still lined with books she'd never read, the kitchen untouched, the windows locked in place. But the shadows seemed deeper now, the light from the city street outside casting strange shapes across the walls. The world beyond the windows seemed brighter, faster, more aggressive than she remembered. Kate sat down on the couch, pulling her knees to her chest as she wrapped her arms around them. The exhaustion, the mental toll of everything she had lived through, was starting to settle in. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. It had been weeks since she'd left the forest, and yet every moment felt like she was still there, caught in some limbo between the world she had known and the nightmare she had survived. The phone in her pocket buzzed, snapping her back to reality. She fumbled for it, her fingers still trembling from the tension that hadn't left her since the moment she had stepped onto the helicopter. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Kate hesitated for a moment before answering, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be? She hadn't given anyone her new number. She hadn't spoken to anyone from the outside world in days, too terrified of what might be on the other side of the line. "Hello?" she asked, her voice shaky. A pause, a breath. Then the voice on the other end sent a chill through her body. "Kate," the voice said, soft and familiar. It sounded like her friend, Sarah. But it couldn't be Sarah. It wasn't possible. The voice was too clear, too perfect. She could hear the slight rasp in it, the same tone Sarah had when she was tired, when she was worried. It was too real. "Sarah," Kate breathed, her mind struggling to piece together the impossible. She leaned forward, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. How are you?" But the voice on the other end wasn't Sarah. It was something else. It mimicked Sarah's voice so perfectly that Kate felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The voice that had once been comforting, a sound full of warmth and familiarity, now held a sharp, metallic edge, distorted like it was being filtered through a long, dark tunnel. "They know you're here, Kate," the voice whispered, too calm, too controlled. "They're still watching you." Kate's hand froze on the phone, her breath caught in her throat. She knew the creatures had followed her. They had never let her go. The forest had never truly been left behind. It had only changed shape, taking root in the city, in her life, in her mind. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fear creeping into the edges of her words. The voice on the phone didn't answer at first. Instead, it laughed. A low, mocking laugh that sent a cold shiver down Kate's spine. "Don't trust anyone, Kate, not even yourself," the voice warned. "We're always here. We're always watching." Kate's blood ran cold as the voice faded, replaced by static. The line went dead before she could react, before she could ask any more questions. For a moment, Kate sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding in her chest. The room around her seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter against her. She had barely registered that the phone was still pressed to her ear until the screen went dark. She dropped it onto the couch beside her, her fingers numb, her mind racing. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But she knew better. A quiet, chilling realization crawled through her like a whisper. They were still out there. The creatures, the hunger, the twisted, mimicking voices. They had followed her back to the city, to the place where she thought she was safe. And then, just as the silence of the apartment seemed to suffocate her, something caught her eye. Through the living room window she saw it, him. A face, familiar and grotesque, staring up at her from the shadows of the alley below. Kate's breath hitched in her throat as she pressed her hand to the window, her eyes locking with the figure on the street below. It was the same face, the same distorted, twisted mockery of Lucas's face. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, just like the creature's eyes had in the woods, glowing faintly in the dark. They were not gone. They were closer than ever. The forest had followed her, had found her. Kate stumbled back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She backed away from the glass, but her gaze was drawn back to the figure in the shadows. His face, no, its face, was still there, staring up at her. Not moving, just watching, waiting. The breath she had been holding rushed out in a sharp gasp. She turned, frantic, looking around the apartment as though it might somehow protect her. But there was nowhere to hide from this. The creatures were here in her life, in her world, and they would never leave her. They were already inside her mind. Kate's hands trembled as she grabbed her coat from the back of the chair. She didn't know what to do, where to go. She had no plan. All she knew was that the city, with its noise and chaos, was no more of a sanctuary than the tower had been. The creatures had infiltrated everything. She walked to the door, her heart still racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to get out. But before she could reach for the door handle, there was another sound, a knock, slow, steady, methodical. Her hand hovered over the door, her breath catching in her throat. She knew who it was before the words even came. Kate, the voice from the other side, was unmistakable. The same voice, the one that had mimicked Sarah, now calling her name in the same low, distorted timbre. "Let us in, Kate." Her stomach churned as she backed away from the door, the cold panic settling deep in her bones. The city had never been safe, not from them, not from this. And she knew deep in her bones that the nightmare she had escaped was only just beginning. The creatures hadn't followed her. They had found her. And now, the hunt was on. The sound of the knocking grew louder, and the voice, twisting, darkening, called out again, "Kate, you can't hide from us." She stumbled back, her hand fumbling for the phone again, desperate for some kind of answer, some way to stop the madness that was closing in around her. But all she could hear was the voice, getting louder, getting closer. "Kate, open the door. We're right here." And she knew, without a doubt, that she would never be free. Kate Adler's harrowing journey through the forest, her desperate fight for survival, and the twisted reality she faced in the fire lookout tower serve as a chilling reminder of how fear and isolation can distort perception, manipulate the mind, and lead one down a dark, uncharted path. At the heart of her ordeal lies a battle not only against the supernatural creatures lurking in the woods, but also against her own psyche, fractured by the relentless terror of being hunted. Throughout her journey, Kate's strength and resilience are tested in unimaginable ways. From the very first whisper of her name in the forest, to the nightmarish figures mimicking those she loved, and the eventual collapse of the tower itself, Kate faces an overwhelming and unrelenting horror. Yet, despite all the horrors, the one thing that remains clear is Kate's unyielding will to survive. Her determination to not succumb to the forces that sought to consume her shows the incredible power of the human spirit, even when faced with something as unimaginable as shape-shifting monsters that feed on fear. However, the true horror of her story lies not in the creatures, but in the revelation that these events were part of a much larger, darker program, one where human lives were sacrificed as mere bait for experimentation. What makes this story so powerful is its subtle, creeping realization that there is no true escape from the horrors we face. Kate may have left the physical confines of the tower and the forest, but the monsters, the psychological torment, and the emotional scars never truly leave her. They follow her into the city, into her normal life, proving that the trauma of our past, especially when it is both personal and unexplainable, can haunt us in ways we cannot control. Kate's story highlights that the mind can be its own prison, and the fear we carry, whether real or imagined, is something that has the power to follow us and shape our lives long after the physical dangers have passed. The story of Kate Adler is a metaphor for the psychological battles we all face in life, be it trauma, fear, or the weight of isolation. The creatures in the woods represent the unseen fears that gnaw at us from within, our doubts, our insecurities, our past experiences, and our inability to trust ourselves when faced with challenges. But the core lesson of the story is that no matter how deep these fears run, no matter how overwhelming the darkness may seem, survival is possible through the strength we cultivate from within. Kate's ability to fight back, despite being physically broken and emotionally exhausted, teaches us that resilience is rooted not in external factors, but in the quiet, internal strength we build when we choose to face our fears head-on. Fear, as powerful as it may be, cannot control us unless we allow it to. By recognizing our fears and acknowledging them, we take away their power over us. This story reminds us that confronting our fears, no matter how insurmountable they seem, is the first step toward freedom. In our everyday lives, we all face obstacles, both seen and unseen. Whether it's an overwhelming challenge at work, a personal battle with mental health, or the aftermath of a traumatic experience, the key takeaway from Kate's story is that we are stronger than we often give ourselves credit for. The darkness may seem eternal, but the light we carry within us can illuminate the path to survival and healing. What do you think about Kate's journey? Have you ever faced a situation where fear and isolation clouded your judgment, only for you to later realize that your own inner strength was the key to your survival? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Please feel free to comment below and share your perspective with others. Lastly, If you enjoyed this story and the insights shared, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to support the channel. Your support keeps us motivated to create more compelling and inspiring content, and we can't wait to bring you the next story. Thank you for being part of this journey.